this was such a huge problem back when we were working on Crashlands is we could not figure out genre-wise what to call this game or how to define it, you know? Which is why it's kind of nice to be making a sequel because we can just be like, it's a sequel to that game. Butterscotch. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 377 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the tools programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm the artist.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's August 19th. 2020. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity on this show. Curses too, swears, all kinds of words. So if you're not into that, then you just don't have to listen. We'd also like to thank our supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you very much for your recurring donations to support the podcast. All right. Now, I can't believe we just got straight through that.
I was holding it back.
Holding it. I'm so proud. I'm so proud. This is one of those rare occurrences. All right, fellas. We got a few things to talk about today. One is Cult of the Lamb. Mm-hmm. So we do a thing on our podcast called Nail or Whiff, where we talk about a game or a book or whatever, and not about whether it's good or bad, but just did they succeed at what they were trying to do? Mm-hmm. Did they nail it or did they whiff?
And we can also talk about if we like what they tried to do, right? But that's
but then that's just personal preference at that point.
Yep.
Yeah. So what do you got, Sam?
Yeah. So I played Cult of the Lamb. And for those who aren't familiar with it, it's basically a cult simulator / action roguelike game. So you think about a game where you basically dive into random dungeons, plus a game where you are trying to recruit and organize cult followers, and you kind of smash them together. That's what the game is. Thematically, it's got this sort of, I don't know if anyone remembers those Happy Tree Friends cartoons.
Oh, yeah.
They're really grotesque, but adorable sort of thing from the early internet days.
Those were horrible.
Yeah, absolutely horrifying. So
if you don't know what that is, I don't even think I recommend looking it up.
Don't look it up.
It's basically ultra violence, but with like little adorable cartoon creatures. So This is actually has a similar vibe to it. It's a little less disgusting, but very much still on the like, wow, I can't believe that happened. In that you play as a lamb, basically a sacrificial lamb who becomes the God-appointed leader of this rising cult, and you do stuff like you do blood sacrifices, you do all sorts of like weird, spooky shit that you would do in a sort of a demonic occult cult situation. But as this adorable lamb, and then all of your followers are these adorable other, creatures. And I gotta say, so one, they nailed it. So if you're into sort of roguelikes, action games, and or the more of the kind of simulator aspect of something like that, if it sounds fun to build your own cult, I guess to you. You could,
of course.
Yeah, you got to do it.
Is it so? There's like a management part for like your cult thing, and then is it like a twin stick shooter kind of a gameplay? Or
it's more like essentially like a dungeon crawler hack and slash sort of a thing.
Okay.
So yeah, the loop works by essentially you go out on these crusades, right? Which is your little going out and doing your action adventure part of it. Combat's really simple. It's not, and there's difficulty settings and stuff. So if you're not particularly into that, then you don't have to do it too much. But then you come back home and essentially are using the devotion that your followers have like built up from praying at an altar for you to unlock new stuff and basically a tech tree. And then they basically have like a couple different kinds of currencies and a couple of different tech trees essentially, but they're all branded as, one's from devotion from your followers. One is from, basically doing like sacrifices and stuff like that of your followers and all sorts of other goofy stuff. So what I think is really, really interesting about it, one is that, so the game's, it's in 3D, but it is all 2D characters and 2D artwork, right? The studio who does it's called Massive Monster, and they had a previous game I cannot remember the name of, but it basically does like they have a really good use of 2D and spine, I guess, is sort of the point. And the previous game also is hilarious, like looking, and it's all sorts of really goofy shit going on. And this sort of just seems to take it to the next level where the character animations and stuff, it's all simple, like all the art's what you call quote unquote simple, But the way that they've kind of piled it all together, and then with a bunch of post-processing effects and really smart use of depth of field and some other stuff like that, the whole thing just looks great. Like it looks really, really good.
Yeah, look at the screenshots. It's got. Well, it also has a thing. So we've talked about in the past about you can get a mismatch between the appearance of your game and therefore who comes to it and the gameplay experience when you're using cute stuff, right? Because cute stuff signals like, oh yeah, this is like a fairly chilled, whatever kind of experience. It's not as simple as that, right? But it can very often do that. And so if there's a huge mismatch and it comes in, it's like an impossibly difficult game or something, or super violent or whatever, right? Then that mismatch can basically get the wrong people into your game. Mm-hmm. And as I'm looking at the screenshots for this thing, it's really interesting because like Sam, like you said, it's about cute creatures and stuff. And the art style is like cutesy, but every single picture I'm looking at looks dark and spooky, right? Mm-hmm. Because they still made sure that like the vibe, while it is cute, the vibe is very much like spooky cult, like kind of stuff. So it's weird.
So that's okay. What I think is most interesting about it. So one is the overall design construction of like how all these loops interact with each other is just very smart. Like it's very smart. If you want to take time to be a kind of chill and just kind of build up your base or go fishing, like there's a fishing area. There's a dice mini game somewhere else. You could just go like play dice against some creatures, like bet money and stuff.
So it's a AAA title because they've got games inside of games.
Yeah, they got games inside of games. So we're AAA at this point. I don't know if you call them indie anymore.
Triple I think is the
triple I
term.
They do a great job of providing basically different speeds, right? And just the number of activities that you could do continues to feel very, very. We talk about games that sort of feel like they keep on opening up over time, and I think it probably was like maybe 7 hours in where finally I was like, I think I'd like basically seen all of the systems. And the most interesting is that it's only like a 12-hour game. I say only, of course, but like it's a 12-hour experience. It's pretty. I wouldn't say it's like hard at the end. You can keep on playing once you do your final thing, but it's a shorter. It's like a really compressed overall loop and experience. So very much it'll grab you by the face and kind of pull you along for the whole ride. What I think is most interesting about it from a design standpoint is if you want to talk about the power of a theme to effectively tie together things that without a theme in place would be, I think, almost impossible to try to think through how to unify all of them. I think it's a perfect example of this, where what you've got here is you have a base building simulator with with little buddies and stuff who you have to monitor their happiness. You have to like clean up their poop. You got to cook for them, etc. You've got an action roguelike where you're running around doing pretty intense combat stuff that's kind of gets bullet helly at certain times. And being able to merge those two things together, it's not that it's not possible. It's just that there's like an infinite number of questions that you could be answered in an infinite variety of ways.
Oh yeah.
And so picking a thing,
it's like it's combining a slow, chill kind of overall gameplay with a very fast, intense kind. And trying to balance that, because also for the audience who is usually coming for one or the other of those experiences and not both. So it's very challenging.
Yeah, I think what the theme allows you to do and what the power of the artwork then allows you to do and bolstering that is to bring people in to do both, because it's not about the whole time you're actually superseding whatever the loops are and you're sort of focused on whatever the theme is. Like I'm here to run this cult, like in all ways that a cult can be run. And I think that's what's fascinating about the theme application here is you have stuff like you eventually get missionaries, who you're sending off to do stuff for you asynchronously from your base. You can summon demons. You could turn your followers into little demons that then come with you on your missions. The action roguelike portion is framed as the crusading kind of portion of the game, right? And so the frame that they've chosen and just how far they managed to go with it, I think, is just really, really effective for making a particularly challenging kind of design mashup into one where the whole thing really just kind of sings really effectively. And I think it's because it's actually under this umbrella of like, what would be all of the activities that you could do if you were running a cult, more or less, right? Especially in this sort of more fantastical, cartoonish violence version of it. And they just nailed it. They just nailed it. So I'd highly recommend.
So is there some kind of like an end point of like what's your real goal?
So you basically you're the final lamb. Essentially, you get executed, and then you are given the basically like the hat, the little cult hat of this god who has stopped you from dying, who has basically chained in the underworld. So he's stuck. So then you are become that god's emissary to raise his cult, etc. And your goal is to defeat the 4 other gods who were the ones who chained this one, and then to basically turn your cult over to the big god. And boss fights are big and fun and crazy, and it's about like a 12-hour thing. So
you've got to just defeat the other cults, basically.
Yep.
Become the one true religion of the world.
It's very fun.
So at the end, you graduate from cult to religion, I guess, because your god is the only one remaining.
Yeah. Yep.
Nice. Okay, so you recommend? I mean, it sounds pretty dope.
It does sound dope.
Yeah, and I like the idea of. It's something that we've talked a lot about in our designs of trying to find those, multimodal games where it's like you can go in and do something intense and fast paced and challenging, and then for a while, go do something chill and slow paced that doesn't require such intense focus, and it's so difficult to have both of those in a game and in a way that feels like they both are fully realized, like so often. You can see that people the developers spend lots of time on intricate combat systems and, whatever. And then they'll have like fishing or something like that. But it's just kind of,
there.
click a button and a fish comes out, right? And so technically they've got it, but it's not fully realized, And of course, like we're guilty of this in some of our games as well, because like it's really hard to fully realize every angle of a game that has so many layers to it. But it is something that we're trying to, focus on more as we get into Crashlands 2 stuff, is take that time to really flesh those things out. So
I think that's where those thematic, defining and finding a really good thematic overarching link is a big piece, I think, of the puzzle. I think it's why crafting and survival games tend to be like a pretty interesting amalgamation of a bunch of different things, is because they're actually thematic more so than genre specific in a weird way, right? Like survival, the idea of survival conceptually is a big umbrella theme,
Well, and it's really almost because the vast majority of video games are about like,
not dying.
Kill or be killed, right? So, in a sense, like survival is actually, of course, as a genre, it's more specific. It's more about like,
it's wilderness survival, I guess.
It's more about it being out in the world than it is like that. But that is true though. There's not much of a genre, but that's why I like Ark. It's fucking fantastic, right? Because there's nothing like it thematically where you get to go
ride
dinosaurs.
Yeah, and I'd almost think about it. I mean, to me, that crafting games are kind of misframed in a lot of ways because they're really item games. Like they're games about getting lots of different kinds of items, and the crafting part is just a transformation. It's like take these 3 items and they become this 4th kind of item, right? And so, because like one of the things we talked about in our when we're working on original Crashlands was that when you buy stuff from a merchant in a game, that's really no different than a crafting system. It's just that everything just uses one ingredient.
Yeah, you exchange one ingredient,
right? Yeah. You get money in the game, and then you're quote crafting it by like giving up some gold and getting a weapon in return, as opposed to getting like 3 logs, 10 sticks, and a rock and turning it into a weapon, right? Which is really just then it's like, okay, those are just different kinds of currencies that you're sort of using to buy this new weapon, right? And so it's really just like crafting is just item conversions. Because when I think about
is an interpretation, not an actual mechanism. Right?
Yeah, because when you think about a game like EVE Online, everything, every spaceship in that game, every weapon, everything is made by players. Nobody calls EVE Online a crafting game, a space crafting game, right? When really that's the engine. Like crafting is the engine that drives literally everything that happens in the multiplayer universe of that game, right? And so I think it's so interesting that some games get branded as a crafting game when crafting is similar in importance or even less important than it is in other games where crafting is a huge driver, right? And those games are just like, oh, that's just an MMO, right? Or whatever. So I don't know.
I think the thing that puts something into the crafting genre is more about the resource collection within the. It's because in Eve, you're still like buying, like using currency, right? To buy the stuff that you used to make.
No,
your
there's
ship.
mining. Like you get ships and you go on your mine asteroids and you go like exploring and hacking little like relic sites to get things out of them. And
Yeah, so that's a crafting game,
like,
then.
I mean, it's straight up a crafting game, like through and through. But it's not framed that way because I think the crafting is far removed from a relatable experience where like people are going and like chopping some wood and like getting a rock and like tying it together with a stick. But at Eve, it's like you're using a mining laser and using blueprints and factories and stuff, right? It's like it's so abstracted that it doesn't feel like you are building something. It's more like you're setting a bunch of things in motion, you know, with a bunch of materials. But yeah, I don't know.
It's funny how much the context and then kind of the, you know, original progenitor of a genre, like how much that dictates what gets categorized that way, even though like functionally, because it's kind of like survival also has a category that's almost always paired with crafting, right? Like, because it's about like being out in the world and changing it and trying to stay alive while you're there. But to the point where you can then play a game like original Crashlands, which is not a survival game because
you're going to survive.
Like
there's no permadeath. There's no hunger.
Yeah, we don't actually have any of the trappings of survival, and so we actually intentionally use surthrival to describe it to try to offset people's default.
But that doesn't
categorization. But trying to like make people stop. What the fuck is that, right? But it doesn't matter because that was actually one of the things that made it difficult with OG Crashlands from a marketing perspective is people would see it. And then because, you know, top-down cartoon, crafting game out in the wilderness, they're like, oh, this is Don't Starve, which is the sort of classic survival crafting game, like in that view and stuff, right? And we're like, no, like the actual experience doesn't feel anything like that because it's not survival, right? But people couldn't decouple.
Yeah. Crashlands is survival in the same way that like Zelda is a survival game.
Or Diablo, you know?
Yeah. In the sense that like you go out in the world and you get stuff and there's stories and quests and sometimes you craft things, right? But yeah, and then like coming into Crashlands 2, crafting is of course at a focal point of the game, but there are other ways to get things, right? Because there is story, there are, you know, quests and that kind of thing. So it's this weird kind of mix of like this was such a huge problem back when we were working on Crashlands is we could not figure out genre wise what to call this game or how to define it, you know. That's why it's kind of nice to be making a sequel because we can just be like, it's a sequel to that game. Yeah. So now we would do Anchor Point. All right, let's talk about Crashlands 2 a little bit before we get into questions. So this week has been pretty cool. We so for the past, I think, 2 weeks, we've been working on putting together the questing system in the game. So at the start of last week, it was all about just design and kind of like talking through and figuring out what is a quest, how does it work, how does the player interact with quests in the world, how do characters convey dialogue and information, you know, all that stuff. So over the first part of last week, it was all about getting that put together in the Game Changer, which we talked about, I think, on last week's episode. And then this week was all about refinement of those systems and adding in all the things that make them actually playable. Because like just because you have quests doesn't mean that it's a good experience if, for example, they don't get saved to disk between gameplay sessions. If every time you boot up the game, you gotta see every quest all over again, that's a nightmare, right? So there's lots of extra layers of systems that have to be put in there so that the quests are, you know, playable. So that's what this week was all about. But one of the kind of goofy things that in retrospect is obvious, but in the moment may seem just like an annoyance is this idea of testing the quests. So quests are a really hard thing to test because they chain together. They are location dependent. They're character dependent. Like if Steve needs to give you a quest and he's over on, you know, an island 300 miles away, how are you going to test that quest? You got to be able to get over there to Steve. But then what if Steve's quest actually requires 16 other quests to be completed before you get there, right?
Then on top of that, like And also, like, the quests might check your inventory to see if there's something in there, you know? Like, so you have to make sure that you have, but also, even if you do bypass and, like, jump right ahead to that island, like, you know, go to God mode, transport yourself, whatever.
Yeah.
How do you test that you actually could have gotten over there if you hadn't done that?
Yeah.
You know?
So, yeah. And so what makes quests a very fraught testing environment is that they're made of just these layers and layers of interdependencies. And being able to easily jump around into different snapshots of states of the questing environment is really important. So by that, I mean saying like, all right, I want to test that quest. So you need to be able to jump to that quest, which means that if that quest had a bunch of quests before it, then those would have to also be set as completed automatically, right? Because that's what it would be if you got to that point.
And if that would have given you loot and all that kind of
then
stuff,
you gotta then you need to get those items. And if like the state of the world had changed because some story elements happened in those prior quests, the state of the world needs to be updated, right? And so all those things need to be true. So in the original Crashlands, I don't think we had any systems like that until like 3 months after we had most of the campaign in, right?
I think it was at the end of the campaign being in, we kept on running into some situations where we needed to be able to, because I was basically like it took about 3.5 or 4 months, I think, to put that campaign together once we had the tooling for it.
And then once we had like 350 quests, about that point, we started thinking about adding.
Because basically what I was doing is I would write the quest and test it, and I was writing them in linear fashion, then testing them in linear fashion, and so I sort of just writing. I was like, write it, test it, and then now it's saved, and you're done with it. So I hope it's good. Move on to the next one, which in retrospect is horrifying in terms of
it's pretty wild.
Yeah. And we did most of our like testing and editing and stuff just happened in the editor. Not in the game at all, because the editor just showed you all the quests. So it's basically we were just testing like the chain. Like, does the chain actually exist and do what it was supposed to? And like via my eyeballs, is this like behaving the way that I think that it's supposed to, right?
Yep.
But yeah, everything was tested basically once as it was developed in the actual game context. And then we got down to like our final beta test, and like people reported fucked up bugs and like all this stuff. And then we're trying to like figure out how to replicate it to fix it, which means we're trying to like get to a quest and like it was
it was hard. Not good.
Yeah. And so it's easy as a developer to be like, quests are in, the system is in, we can start adding quests, it's fine. And to look at something like developing an additional system that allows you to jump around and test quests and force set them to different states and stuff, and view that as kind of like bells and whistles. Like that's just some kind of like developer quality of life thing. But having gone through it in the past, I look at it as like this quest system, I don't even consider it to exist unless we have that tool, unless we have that interface, because we shouldn't be adding quests to the game at all if we can't test them, if we can't verify that they're working as intended. So this was pretty cool. So one of the things we talked about in some of our episodes a while back was this interface tool that we developed called Cake Frames, which took a couple of months to put together. And it's basically a way of describing in-game interfaces using a standardized format. So all of the interfaces in Crashlands 2 over time have become cake frame interfaces. And it's this way of just easily describing what you want the interface to look like, and then it just gets parsed by the game, and then it gets rendered as you would expect.
It's a lot like how HTML works.
It's kind of like we put together our own little HTML style language, and instead of a web browser, it's the game, right? And so that was one of those things that it took so long to do. Mm-hmm. And
also, your brain was probably twice as wrinkly when you were done, because there's some tricky problems in that. Yeah, because one of the hardest things about interfaces is how interdependent they are. So if you say like, I want this button to be in like the bottom left corner of this window, right? Well, okay, but what if there's other stuff down there? How does it sort itself, to make sure it doesn't overlap? And like, how do you know where the window is? And how do you make sure the button is clickable? And like, what even is a button? What makes something a button versus
a drop down menu, you know? And so there's just all these things that you kind of take for granted when you're just clicking around on web pages that you have to actually define. So it took a long time to build that stuff with the hope of like with basically saying being able to easily build interfaces should dramatically expand our ability to make our games, right? Yep. And so this quest thing was a great example of that, where in literally just a day, I was able to put together the system of force setting quests to different states and jumping around, and build a developer interface that allows us to visualize the states of all the quests and actually interact with that system behind the scenes. So it was just like easy peasy, 1, 2, done.
That's the sort of
thing that we waited like months and months for Crashlands. And then we did do it in the original game. It took weeks to like figure out all the things to be able to test the quests. Now it was like 1 day, one and done. No problem.
I think that's been wild to me about this the past 2 weeks in particular, seeing again the quest system as the first kind of new system coming alive inside of the Game Changer completely. And with cake frames up and running and all this other stuff, and it's like the speed with which we actually get to move to the next state of these things, do some testing and answer the next questions, and then just basically already have that done then again within like a day. It's just ridiculous. Like we talked about the goal was to move it so the questions were more about what specifically to do, no longer so much about just how the fuck do we do it, right?
About the cost and the how, you know.
And so it's been fascinating, I think, seeing that actually play out now in the past couple of weeks. And I think there's always this small bit of terror I think all of us were nursing there for like that whole 6 months, where it was like, you never know while developing a tool or something like that if there's going to be one of those roadblocks you hit at some point that makes it impossible to actually utilize, right? It's just happened.
I've run into many of these over.
There were quite a few points when working on the Game Changer and on Cake Room stuff where it's just like,
you're like,
this is wrong. This is wrong. Like we shouldn't spend 2 more months working on this tool because what if I can't solve this? This next 3 or 4 problems that I know are coming, right? It's terrifying.
It's very because it would just amount to end up, you don't actually have infinite time until you have infinite runway, which we're not there. So you end up in this position where you're like, man, this could, if I can't figure out a way around this, then this is all for naught. Because if the tool doesn't manage to do all the stuff, oftentimes it doesn't deliver on the thing it's supposed to deliver on, and then
then you worry about like. Yeah, if you burn 6 months working on this thing and then it turned out to not pan out, then you've just lost 6 months of dev time on your game, and you've made your game's code base more complicated because you've been integrating a tool that doesn't work. And then who knows? Maybe you miss your launch window. Maybe your runway runs out. Like you sink the company. Like
not fun.
Time is money, and spending a lot of time on something means potential financial danger if you're not careful.
So, I think what's been really just, very buoying, I know for me personally too, has been seeing the actual effects of it downstream, because it is the part of the thing was like, you need to take less time when putting an interface together. So it'll take like 4 days, it'll take like 2 hours or something. And that's all well and good, but I think what you don't realize is just that it's actually a lack of frustration that's showing up while working on these things. That is, to me, an even bigger piece of it, where it still allows you to be flexible and play, essentially, or to iterate on the fly while making the thing.
It's why the work experience is actually needs to be the priority, right? What it's like to do the work to make the product, right? Because what it is frustrating. Because sounds like, to your point, like in lots of contexts, like 2 hours way better than 2 days, but also 2 days probably fine, right? In like so many contexts, but it's still. That's a much bigger investment, but also if it's frustrating the whole time, then it has an even more outsized effect. So not only is it already like 10 times more time, but that time is going to move a third as fast, right?
Yeah. Right.
And kind of fuck the rest of like the days afterwards and so on, right? So that you end up not only just having a bad experience with all of that, but the cost of doing it is so high, and it's high up front, and you're already kind of perseverating on the fact that it's not going to be a good experience, right? And so your default is to then not do it. And so you take these kinds of systems that we're talking about here. We're saying that if we don't have a good way to manipulate and explore quests, then doing QA on them, debugging them, that kind of stuff becomes really hard, right? But those are still like things you can like manually just throw hours at to like overcome those, right? And so in a case where this was hard, that might have been the path that we went down, so that we said, or we just did it later. Either way, there would be a time period where we just didn't have that. And we just would rely on the people making quests to throw the hours at it to try to figure out how to like debug it, right? And so now you've translated a thing that was going to be a bad experience for one person into a thing that's a bad experience for everybody else. And
it just means you just get less of it, because if something is hard, if something is a bad experience, you just will do it less. Yep. You don't, it's like, if you think about your toolbox, you got all your different tools in there, right? It's like, all right, well, if one of your wrenches just has like a floppy, piece on the end of it that like it doesn't actually hold on to the bolts, right? They're like, okay, well, like I'm only going to use that wrench as a last resort. If I have no other options, that's the only time I'm going to grab that wrench out of the toolkit, because it just sucks to use, right? And so that's what ends up happening here, is that if it's super easy and fun for us to build interfaces in the game, then we just will build interfaces that allow us to make our development lives easier, right? If we're like, man, I really wish I could see this thing, or I really wish I could interact with like this system in the game as a developer and like see what it's doing and have some like ways to manipulate it. Well, that's an interface problem. Seeing things and manipulating data is like, the data's already there. It's already in the game. You just need to be able to see it. So if you can make an interface in an afternoon very easily that just does all those things, and then it's ready to go, then that's gonna be one of the first tools that you grab, right? And
you're gonna do it. You're not gonna put up with the stuff that's frustrating, because like you can't see this information you want, right? So you're not gonna just put up with that. You're gonna solve it.
Just do that.
Yeah, I think this thing that gets lost, this topic comes up a lot because we're always talking about tooling and stuff. But this gets lost all the time in discussions that people have about whether or not you should be investing in improving your work experience versus using that time to push, to quote unquote do the work, right? And
just not treating that
as part of it
and push forward.
Yeah, because the joke is always like, oh, you could spend 6 hours to save 5 minutes, right? And people joke about that disparagingly because they don't realize that it's not just time, right? It's also everything about your actual life experience, and that has so many downstream consequences. But it's also in what you end up deciding to do with that time, because people treat it just like, oh, you just move the time to one place, right? Yeah. And that's like all that happens.
It's the Jevons paradox. If you made a thing way easier,
you're going to use it more,
better, then you're going to use it more. So the time saving is actually way, way more than you would think. Like it's something that we found. One of our first kind of like things of stumbling across this was when we first built the game pipe and our automated patch notes, right? It's like we would deploy a patch like on Fridays, basically, in the past, and patch notes were written by hand, and I deployed the patches with my machine. So like I wasn't programming while that was happening, because it uses all your CPU to compile the game and stuff, right? So it's like, if it takes a half hour and you've got to write a Google Doc every time you deploy a patch, and if all you think about is, okay, well, should we invest a bunch of time to cut that 1 hour, down to a minute? Well, it's really only going to save us an hour a week, because we're only doing one patch a week, right? It's like, okay, well, yeah, except once we automated it, we're doing like 3 patches a day, right?
Yeah,
because we can.
And Seth doesn't think about it. It's not. Yeah. It doesn't go into any decision making you do anymore, except for just the like, oh,
do I have something for me to test?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, deploy, done.
Now the part of it that matters to you in your role, which is I've made features, I want them tested, right?
Deploy,
right? You're getting what you need out of the feature and nothing more. There's no additional cost, right? And that's changed. And I mean, if you think about how much we've invested into our game pipe like system, right? That's been basically Sure's job for 2 years of time, right, collectively. And that's a huge investment, right? Mm-hmm. But the gains we get from it It's so valuable. It's the same deal with like, we talk about spending 6 months, right? Like building this UI tool and the game changer, right? And that is an enormous investment for a company to make because human time, extremely expensive, right? And it's easy if you were just to compute the numbers, you'd be like, holy shit, that's a big number, right? This seems like such a risky, absurd thing to do, right? But the reality is like the way that changes everything about what we then do for the rest of time after that is so enormous that looking at it as anything but an investment, right, is the wrong lens. If you're just thinking about it as a cost and only thinking about it in like 1-to-1 time savings, right, and nothing else.
Now, there is a hidden downside, though. Okay, so bear with me on this. All right. Once your tools get really, really good, then you can do anything, right? Anything you want to do, you can do it, which means that whatever you end up doing is exactly what you thought was the best thing to do, right?
Oh, it's on you, baby. It's
and
all
now
your
if
fault.
that doesn't work, you can't blame anything anymore, right? You got to be like, man, I was unconstrained. I didn't just like do the best with what I had because I had everything. Whatever I wanted to do, I made that happen, and boy, did I fuck that up. So there is a psychological burden that comes with like the responsibility of having good tools, as your decisions are yours alone.
I know you're joking about the degree, but it's actually very true.
It's real.
It's very real, which is like, because where we're at too with Crashlands 2 dev stuff is basically the only thing that you could say that as far as like a upfront decision that we had made that we could have made differently would be something like being in 3D, right? Like being in Unreal or something.
Or
like
being multiplayer or something.
Or multiplayer, yeah. But so outside of those two things, which are admittedly big, but outside of those two things, within the kind of the scope of a 2D kind of open world adventure game, and with the tooling we have, it does feel like we're in that spot where it's very much if this
whatever we want to do.
Yeah, if this does not work, it's because we made a bunch of stupid decisions, not because we were running up against problems that couldn't be solved, or that was we had to hack around this thing because it was too much of a pain in the ass or whatever.
Yeah, we'll talk about scope creep too, right? Because when all scopes seem manageable, then you can really run into some scope creep problems, right? Because still everything has cost, right? But it's moving the cost to where it used to be, which we're used to reasoning about, which is it's really hard and really costly to make the feature work, right? And now we're moving the space, like the hard space somewhere else, which is making a system whose content all works really well together in sort of an almost arbitrarily complex collection of arrangements, right? Because that's what we're creating with Crashlands 2. Like that's actually moved from a technical problem to a design and testing problem, right? But mostly design. And because as you're saying, if we can design it, we can build it, right?
But should you? That becomes.
But should you?
Should you do this?
And we're also hard. So I think it's actually really good that we did all this while also building Crashlands 2, because building Crashlands 2 constrains us at least to a degree by the fact that it's
having it be kind of like the original.
So we're sort of, I think if we would just set out to build all this stuff and build a new IP and a new gameplay.
Oh, that's where
we usually do.
just end up in open water.
We would have run out of runway. There's
no land around. Just drifting at sea in a beautiful yacht.
Our design. I mean, our design style very much is just ADHD. Like that's our design method, right? It's like what seems interesting right now. Let's chase that shiny object. And of course, like if you can chase that shiny object to its destination in like 3 days, right? Then, and you're working on a game for 2 years, it's like, man, how many just random fucking things just end up in the game that maybe don't need to be there because it's just diluting the experience.
Well, it's then the combinatorial complexity, because the thing is, even though you can keep on making stuff, and if you make it in this like really nice modular way so things can interact, and you don't have to specifically describe like every interaction, right? Because they just happen as a consequence of the general rules. Then the combinatorial complexity is what actually becomes the enemy, because that is something you can't just like technology your way around, right? Yeah. You can make it easier to manage.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can't just, if you have 100 kinds of things, like completely, like, with their own rules and stuff, right? That all interact with each other. And within each one of those kinds of things, you have, 20 variations that have slightly different tweaks to like how they follow the rules, right? In one screen, in like one moment of time in the game, right? If you've got like 5 random things put on there, like the degree of cognitive complexity here is like, it's one of those numbers that is so much bigger than like the number of atoms in the universe kind of a thing. Like it's like the number of ways things can unfold, and that grows so fast as you add kinds of things. Then that's the part where doesn't matter how good the tools are, right? Doesn't even matter how good the design is. Like
at some point, you're just a bunch of monkeys,
typing a typewriter.
Yep. Can't conceive of it.
So there is a dark side. There's a dark side to tooling.
There's another dark side.
Responsibility.
There's another dark side too, though, which I experienced quite a bit, which is I already have a low tolerance for a bad worker experience, right? And I invest a lot of time into making my like moment to moment work experience really good. My tolerance for then other experiences, because mine just keeps getting better. The fidelity just keeps getting higher, So my tolerance for experiences that don't match that keeps getting even lower than it already was once I've experienced what it can be like, to do something else. So that is the other. I mean, I'll take it. I'll take that risk.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I've thought about. It's like, man, maybe I should just like slap together like a personal game project, just like some goofy little mobile game or something just for fun. And then I think about the decade of tooling that I've put together in our Butterscotch toolkit. And the idea of making a game without all that stuff is just horrifying. Like I can't even fathom it. Anyways, let's get to questions. We got time for probably like a question. So, highest upvoted question from podcast.bscotch.net comes from Mimmabip Gourkee, who says, "What's the most difficult part about designing UIs? And what is your strategy to overcome it?"
Oh,
this is pretty
timely.
So yeah, we kind of covered it largely, but just to kind of summarize in my mind, as a game programmer, making UIs in game engines is really hard because game engines view UIs as optional. Like they're mostly built around physics and collisions and the kind of stuff that gameplay is made of. But the interface, in my opinion, is one of the most important parts because that's how you actually engage with the game. It's how you interact with it. It's the part between you, the person, and the game world, right? And for the longest time, we did just do everything ad hoc where we need an interface. Okay, we'll make a new standalone object, and then we just start like coding up that interface. Like, where does this thing need to be? How many pixels away from this thing is it? And it was this very intricate thing, which usually also involved Sam putting together a design document where he would lay out all the different parts, and then like we would have lots of like slideshows almost. Actually, in some cases, actual slideshows. We would use like Google Slides or whatever to show all the different states of the interface. Yeah. And all this stuff is difficult because interfaces look simple because what you see at any point in time is generally a frozen like a snapshot of that interface in a certain state. But considering all the different things that could be on that interface, because it's showing different kinds of data, different buttons appear or disappear depending on what your options are.
It's again combinatorial complexity.
Yeah. So interfaces are difficult because they have so many components on them that are optional and that also are interrelated with each other, both in terms of whether they exist or not, and also just positionally, like how big are they? Where are they? How do they not overlap each other? And so our solution to that ultimately ended up being to write a tool that allowed us to create interfaces, which is cake frames.
But the important note there is what it's doing, which is it makes the cost of iteration almost zero. That's the trick, because the problem before is that UIs require tightness. That's just sort of a fact. Like a button needs to be in a particular place, needs to be relative to a particular thing.
Yeah,
in a particular way.
And a button, you don't want a button to be like 4 pixels higher than the button next to it.
Yeah,
and which so that's literally unplayable at that point.
Yeah,
I mean, it is like your eyeballs expect something.
Oh,
it's very distracting if things are even just a little bit off. And you'll see that, like, if anybody has built a UI, you look at a thing that you made and you'll be like, I think I need like 5 more pixels on the top, like a padding on the top side, because this just looks wrong, even though technically it claims that they're equal or whatever, right? And like, and a single pixel can make the biggest difference.
Yep.
Yeah, so I think that the tricky bit then basically on the implementation side is finding some tooling or doing something to make it so that the cost of iteration is low. And the reason for that is because UIs, once in use, will oftentimes reveal other things that are needed. And you can get around this as much as possible ahead of time by doing these iterations outside of the game context or outside of wherever the context is you're using it, using wireframing software. I know Adam's been using Figma a little bit.
Figma's cool.
Figma's really cool. It's definitely more complex in terms of being able to essentially be a very good representation of the flows and stuff between all those different things where you're not taking.
And the hierarchical relationships, you can make them so that they reflect pretty accurately what the code will also be doing. Right. Which is very nice. Yep.
Yeah. And then I use something more like Balsamic, which I think maybe just called wireframes now. I can't remember. But it's just they have a web application and desktop application. And the whole point there is it's purposefully sketch-like plugging together of stuff to create your wireframes. So the idea with those is that you then, as on the design side, you basically say, okay, who's using this? What for? What are we trying to accomplish with this UI? Find some references. There's like the game UI database, which is awesome. If you are making a UI and you aren't looking at references, you're wasting a fuckload of time because a lot of people smarter than you have solved these problems already. So you grab some references.
Or even just done really cool stuff that you didn't even... It's not even that solves the problem you had. It's just like a new way of looking at the problem that is also good, but much more interesting that you never would have conceived of.
Yeah. So basically you grab a reference once you know kind of what you're actually trying to do, who it's for, etc. Get your list of all the things you need to actually have present on there, wireframe it out, and then you walk through it with everybody who actually is going to be involved in making it, the programming side, particularly in the art side or whatever else. You get those obvious problems out of the way, like, oh, won't we actually need a follow-on drop-down from this? Or like, oh, what about this whole piece of information that you forgot? Or like not even necessarily that you forgot, but that we forgot. And sort of like, now that I'm seeing all this put together, and this is, I think, the thing people don't get is like, you typically can't get 100% accuracy on any of those mock-ups and stuff like that. Because once the thing is alive, it naturally, you're sort of moving the available thinking space about the problem outward, sort of clearing out some fog of war as you build forward a little bit.
Well, because you mostly focus on the golden path, right? Which is you sit down, you know what you want people to be able to do. And so you imagine a way that a person will work through a series of interactions to accomplish those things, right? So then you try to construct a thing that makes those things easy to do. What's really hard to see is what you also enabled, right?
Yes.
And what will end up being confusing, because you come and you ask, like, can I do the thing that I want to do, that I designed this to do? Or you know exactly how those map onto each other. And so somebody else not only won't know what they even can do, right? So they won't even have that to start with, but they also will see all the other stuff too, right? Mm-hmm. So they're not coming in being like, I want to do this. I bet this can do this. And like laser focus on the thing, right? Mm-hmm. And
yes, that happens.
Yeah, so in the design phase, you have to like take that into account and then try to like take a step back about not just the golden path and try to figure out, okay, how does the user even end up here? And like, what are they actually trying to do? I know what I want them to do, right?
Yeah. What do they know? What do they not know?
What do they not know?
What's going to be overwhelming to them?
And then just know that you're still wrong / incomplete, right? And so you have to then actually have people iterate on it and to Sam's point, they can't. Yeah, they need to actually experience. That's why UI. It's always looked at as like UI / UX. User interface / user experience. Like at least in the web world, those are always paired together. Sometimes it's different people who are focusing on those, but like anybody who's really into the user experience and the user interface side of things is thinking about both all the time. And the experience part is experiential. You have to be able to experience it, and even just describing it, like going through slides on a deck, like that is a lot better than static images, but still isn't there, like it gives you something. It expands the space of things you can learn, but there's nothing compared to actually giving somebody an interface that does actually work. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then seeing them try to do it. Right.
This kind of makes me think of our discussion about why some games are described as crafting games and others aren't, even though crafting may be like more prevalent one than the other. Mm-hmm. Like the idea that you would separately describe the concept of user interface and user experience as if they are two different things. And and also that the user experience is always paired with UI as like a concept, but it's rarely paired with other things. Like, oh yeah, I focus on the database and the user experience. I'm a back-end developer that that thinks about what the data is actually going to be used for.
Well, that's actually in the web tech world, developer experience, which is now shortened to DX because it's the web they do.
Yeah,
So
which is
but like that wasn't even like a thing, until literally a few years ago. And now all of a sudden, like all the major tech companies are like hiring developer experience people whose whole job is to like internally focus on.
But to me, that's like hiring a DevOps engineer.
Yeah, it
where
is.
You're like, that guy's our DevOps guy.
Yeah,
The rest of us don't do DevOps. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, it's a philosophy of approach, and it's just like, what are you thinking about when you do your job, right?
It's like accessibility and security also, right? Like these are all just different layers of what it means for people to interact with stuff, right? And if you treat all of those as just like, okay, that's a separate thing.
They're just different jobs.
We'll hire somebody else to do it or whatever, right?
I build things with no regard to user experience, developer experience, security, or accessibility. I just make the thing.
Yep.
Right. And then it's everybody else's job to figure out like how to make that work. How could you possibly make a good thing?
And this is
with that approach.
Design and making products is very hard, right? Because you technically can make it happen with lots of people who are all experts in one thing. And historically, that's how people did stuff, right? But there's a reason why most user experiences for most people are clunky. And then once you get outside of most people,
because it's somebody else's job.
Impossible. Yeah. And there's also a reason why most things are insecure. And it only takes a little bit of like knowledge to find a way through, right? And it's because as soon as you separate all these things out, then it has to be. So I think that's been to the kind of final answer on this iteration aspect of what we're doing with Crashlands 2, is that we've removed all of the distance between us needing an interface to accomplish something and it technically existing in its context, right? So Sam still does go through a design phase like externally, right? But it very rapidly and neatly maps onto the code.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be hyper specific because it's so easy to update.
Yeah.
Like back when we were doing it, like Sam would have to specify like down to the pixel, like how big this is, what color this is, and now we can just so easily change any of that stuff that it can be more like conceptually, this is basically how this thing is laid out. Here's a quick sketch.
Yeah.
And
then the two of them can iterate on it because it's not that Sam's waiting for Seth to go take a million years to implement something. It's that the two of them can then evaluate it as a consequence.
Yeah, we can just
Sam can present an initial thing. They can sit down together. Seth can spend 30 seconds, like mapping the design onto some code, mapping iteration onto some code, refreshing, right? And then seeing the change happen. So that's it's about removing all the movement between things and making it so that a design can be an experience as quickly as possible, and that everybody involved is paying attention to both. Even if they are experts in one particular aspect of it, they still need to be paying attention to all of it.
Yeah. So just to kind of wrap that up in terms of like something more practical, because of course what we did is, stop production for a couple of months and build a user interface tool, which isn't necessarily your first option, right? Like we did that after like 10 years of working on interfaces. So the real move then is to look for commonalities and try to develop jigs, develop little tools that you can use to solve the same kinds of interface problems over and over again. So like if confirmation boxes are something that you deal with a lot, which they are because you're a developer and everything in the world has confirmation windows, then is there a way that you can make something that spawns a confirmation window and that's just a generic thing that you can reuse and like change how the confirmation window looks, right? Because if you can do that, then like you've solved the confirmation window problem. Do you have buttons? Okay. Can you make some concept that's just a reusable button that you can make it look a little different and like change some things about it, change what it does? So just try to solve all these little individual problems that in reusable ways at first. And at the very least, that will help you kind of get over some of the initial humps of just how hard it is to build these interfaces. And then over time, you may build up a library of knowledge enough that you can start to develop, a tool that solves most of these problems or all of these problems kind of universally, right? But first things first, just try to, just programmatically solve those things.
Yeah. I mean, if you're in web tech, this is exactly what frameworks are for, like React and Vue and Svelte and the 10 new ones that I'm sure were announced this morning. Because
during this podcast.
They just keep on. But like, that's what they're for. They're for reusing stuff, right? Where you can generalize the concepts involved so that you can then tweak a single existence of a thing to like match the specifics that you want. I think was a question about the design or the implementation or both.
It was the design side focus.
Yeah, I think that would actually be just a fun topic to talk about in like the next episode or something. Would be because Sam and I also had a long chat a couple Fridays ago about design for a user interface that I was working on. And we're coming, like he and I are coming to it from different angles because I'm coming from the web world. He's coming from the game dev world where what it means to do those things is different, right? And the goals are also different, and also user expectations are different. But also because I'm coming to it from a code first, design second perspective, because that's what I usually do. And Sam's coming to the other way around. And me and Seth are kind of in a similar position, but since Sam and Seth have always worked together so much, they're more, meet in the middle. So I think it could be an interesting, just like,
all right, we'll put a pin in
designing UIs. What is that like?
How do we even do it? As opposed to like, what's hard about it? Just like, how do we?
Literally everything is hard about it is, I think, the short answer.
Yeah. Everything's hard about everything, turns out. All right, well, that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampat Acosta, for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bsketch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
Bye.